Alright, we're going to finish up that pre-Civil War timeline that we started the other day. We left off with Bleeding Kansas and how it propelled us ever forward towards Civil War. And today we're going to pick up with the later events on that timeline. Let's head straight to the PowerPoint. A lot of times we despair today and think about how divided our Congress is, but that's really nothing compared to what the realities of this time period were. You can see that in 1856 we had something called the Sumner Caning. In the Sumner Caning, a South Carolina senator had heard that Charles Sumner was a famous abolitionist, and Charles Sumner had stood up in the Senate and had mocked Preston Brooks's uncle, who was also in the Congress, had mocked him, and Preston Brooks's uncle, of course, was a Southerner. He had a little bit of a speech impediment, and when Charles Sumner spoke of his uncle in his speech critical of slaveholders, he mocked his speech impediment. And when Preston Brooks heard word of this, Preston Brooks was enraged and decided that really his family's honor had in some way been insulted. And so the code of chivalry for the South was that he had to get retribution for that. So he is in the House of Representatives. He marches over to the Senate. The Senate, there's not a lot of people in the Senate at the moment. The Senate's not full by any means. And he finds Charles Sumner sitting at his desk, and he goes over to him with a cane that has a big brass head on the top of it. And he starts savagely beating Charles Sumner with this cane. Charles Sumner's kind of backed into the corner of his desk, is kind of gotten backed into a space that he can't get out of because his attacker is blocking his only means of getting out. So Charles Sumner is a large man. He actually has to pull the desk, which is bolted to the floor of the Senate. He actually has to pull the desk up out of the floor and stumble up the aisle to get away from his attacker. He's savagely beaten. He does not actually recover for 2 years, and then he actually goes to Europe when he can walk and further tries to gain his health. But every time he starts coming back and trying to go to work, he is debilitated by these terrible his health just quickly takes a decline. We now know he's probably suffering from PTSD, actually, and that's why he did so well in Europe, but when he came back to America and tried to resume his work, he was unable to do so. But it was really an unbelievable act of savage violence in the history of the Congress, and one that just shows the deep divisions of the time period. And after this, members of the House and Senate start carrying knives and guns to the chambers because they now see that violence is a real possibility. So it's considered to be a real low for politics. It's called the Sumner Caning, and South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks caned Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner for insulting slave owners and a family member. He resigns, and he is then re-elected to come back to the House of Representatives. We'll probably be looking in class at some editorials in which it shows how very differently North and South saw this. But Preston Brooks is going to die of natural causes just 2 years later, and so he does not have a long political career or serve jail time either. He's not formally charged or served jail time for this assault. In 1856, we have another election. The election of 1856 elects a Democrat, James Buchanan. He largely is able to be elected because he was an ambassador to Britain during this time period and therefore was considered Kansasless. He had not taken a position on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but would cause him to lose votes from either side. The new Republican Party came in second. Their election nominee was John C. Fremont. And then the anti-immigrant party, the Know Nothing Party, came in third, and we've talked about those parties in another PowerPoint, another video, but this is where they land on the timeline. This shows you Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks and a cartoon of the attack. And this shows you John C. Fremont and his running mate, the ticket for the Republican Party. Alright, in 1857 we have a very controversial ruling on the part of the Supreme Court. It's called the Dred Scott decision. So let me talk to you a little bit about the Dred Scott decision and why it was so stunning what it had said. Alright, for a long time we haven't talked much about this, but there have been free blacks who vote in both the North and the South. After Nat Turner's rebellion, it became increasingly difficult to be a free black in the South because there did form these militias that went about patrolling the South and checking on black black-skinned people who might be traveling or moving about and harassing them and making sure they're not escaped slaves. But there had been free blacks living, voting, all throughout the United States, throughout U.S. history. What happens in this case is there's a slave named Dred Scott, and he is a slave. His master moved to Illinois, a free state, and lived with him for a couple years, and then died. And so Dred Scott had been willed to continue being a slave to the family members of his master. And what he says is, no, I live in a free state, and my master has died, and so since I live in a free state, I should be free. And so he takes this case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hears the case and comes to a pretty stunning ruling. The leader of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is Roger B. Taney. Roger B. Taney, he's an interesting guy, actually. He's the Secretary of the Treasury, the fourth Secretary of the Treasury that Andrew Jackson finally got hired, who would take the money out of the National Bank early. And as kind of a favor for doing that fairly illegal act, Roger B. Taney was then appointed to the Supreme Court, which is a lifelong term. So I don't know much about Supreme Court history, but I have a sense that Roger B. Taney maybe is not the most well-loved and remembered Supreme Court justice. But at any rate, in this Dred Scott ruling, they rule something really surprising. He rules that, first of all, since Dred Scott is black, he's not a citizen. That people with black skin born in the United States are not citizens, and therefore they cannot use the courts. So this is a pretty stunning ruling. People who have lived in the United States with black skin have been, free blacks, have been voting and doing all kinds of things assuming that they are citizens of the United States, and now they've been informed otherwise, despite hundreds of years of practice to the contrary. So first of all, it says blacks are not citizens, the Dred Scott is still a slave, and furthermore, this is the stunning part, he says that slaves are property, just like a dresser or a car. And when you move to a free state with your slave, that they can't take that slave from you, even though it's a free state, because it's your property, and the government cannot take your property without due process of law, according to the Bill of Rights. And so there's no due process, there's no compensation, there's no anything that's going on to make this freeing of the slave palatable in the minds of the Supreme Court. So the Dred Scott ruling is really, really very stunning. It tells you that clearly the Supreme Court is dominated by Southern votes. It ruled that blacks are not citizens and cannot sue in court. And it said that slaves are property and it's illegal to prohibit slavery anywhere. So basically, once you have a slave, you can take your slave anywhere. You want to take it to California? Fine. So really, there's no free states anymore. As long as you have your slave before you move there, you get to keep them. So this whole idea of free and slave states is really going to become kind of a facade. In 1858, we have some famous debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. They're both running for the Senate of Illinois. And this is one of those cases, you know how like Michael Jordan didn't make the basketball team, the JV basketball team at his high school, and it's kind of laughable to think about that now. But we're kind of lucky that Lincoln did not win the Senate seat in Illinois in 1856, or he might not have ever run for the presidency. He and Douglas were debating, it's very high-profile and long debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates, about what their respective positions were on slavery. Lincoln had a very clear position, and sometimes in political times such as these, a clear position can be a detriment because you do alienate people if you have a clear position. And Lincoln's position was this. Slavery can exist where it already exists, but I don't want to see it spread. He said it's not going to spread to the territories. And that was his position. He would oppose the expansion of slavery into the territories. Stephen Douglas had a much more kind of political, classic politician's response, I guess. His response is that, well, we should have popular sovereignty, and even if your state votes for a slave position that you don't like, so let's say you lived in Kansas, and they voted to become a slave state, his position was, well then if in the local laws you pass, you don't have laws that support slavery, then in your local area you could have no slavery, but in your state you might have slavery. So he suggests this kind of Swiss cheese approach where every little locality within the United States will kind of adopt its own positions, and therefore it's kind of a more pandering position, and so it makes more people happy, and therefore it's no surprise why Stephen Douglas wins the election, because he's not alienating any certain side of the debate. So in this case, We have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They're in the Illinois Senate race. Douglas supports popular sovereignty, and he said that slavery can be practically prohibited by not having slave codes on the local level. This is called the Freeport Doctrine, this position that basically you can tailor your slave policy to the local conditions on the ground. And Douglas wins the race. So a little bit of a lesson to people running for office not to take too clear of a position. This is Dred Scott on the left, and this is the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates on the right. That's Stephen Douglas. He was quite a bit smaller, shorter than Lincoln. They were kind of noticeable in terms of their different physical. Oh, what a bummer. My phone rang. Oh well. Guess we'll try and merge these two clips together. In 1859, we have another shocking thing that happens. There's John Brown, who was an ardent abolitionist. He took a vow that he was going to do all he could to end slavery. And a lot of people think John Brown was a black-skinned man, but he was not. He was actually a white man. His name, John Brown, he led a group of men to try and take over an arsenal in Virginia. And his whole goal was to take the weapons out of the arsenal and spread them out to the slaves who he felt surely would rise up and come to the arsenal to get weapons so that they could rebel. However, things don't work out quite like he hoped. The slaves did not rise up and come get weapons, and eventually he was surrounded by federal troops. His slave rebellion failed, and he was executed. He was hanged. And it was a debate about John Brown that broke out. Some people believing in the North that John Brown was like a Christ-like figure, a martyr for a very noble cause. And then the Southerners, of course, considered him to be a terrorist. And so this debate about John Brown and whether he's to be admired or hated further showed the division between the North and the South. Finally, in 1860, it's time for an election. And the Republicans are going to run Abraham Lincoln, who still has a very clear position on slavery, that he's opposed to the spread of it to the territories. And so, you see here I've dropped in this picture of John Brown headed to the gallows. In the election of 1860, the Republicans defeated a divided Democratic Party, and Lincoln wins, even though as he is opposed to the expansion of slavery. It led South Carolina to secede in December, and 10 other states are going to follow. And so this is really going to begin the division of the Union into North Union and Confederate states, being the Southern states. Now, you might wonder, well, if he just didn't want to see slavery spread, why are the Southern states so upset about his being elected? But here's the deal. They knew he didn't want to see slavery spread. And if slavery doesn't spread, eventually the number of free states are going to outnumber the number of slave states significantly. And once that happens, Congress could very easily pass laws to ban slavery. So they see Abraham Lincoln's election as kind of the death knell of slavery, even if immediately Abraham Lincoln doesn't want to end slavery. And so then it's just a matter of the inevitability of time. So South Carolina and those other states are going to secede first, the 7 states to secede first. By the time Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated, he's going to be giving an inaugural address which really speaks to them and basically says, look, we don't need to break up. But very soon after that, there's going to be events which propel the states to, the other 4 states to decide what they're going to do, and they're going to secede as well. And eventually we'll have 11 Confederate states that try and form their own country called the Confederate States of America. They do elect their own president. That's the last piece of the timeline. Their president, who they elect, is named Jefferson Davis. They have their own flag. They have their own constitution. And I'm going to pass over that and instead get to the map. And here you can see these green states are the ones that voted for the Southern Democratic candidate. The Northern Democratic candidate, only Missouri voted for him. We have another party called the Constitutional Union Party that voted here, and then these states voted for Lincoln. So you can see that Lincoln becomes president without a single state in the South, what would become known as the Confederacy, without a single state having elected him, or even he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 of those states. So what the South basically sees is that the North can elect a president with no input from them, and so they really don't feel like they're a part of the Union anymore, and that propels them to secession. Okay, so that's the end of the timeline.